It started like any other day until it wasn't. A black woman walked into the courthouse calm and completely unaware that she was about to be attacked by people sworn to uphold the law. They thought she was nobody. They humiliated her, violated her, and laughed while doing it. But what they didn't know was that they had just attacked the wrong person, because she was not just a normal citizen. She was the only one with the right to destroy them, legally and justly. What happened next was a storm of justice exposed and a courtroom twist that turned everything upside down. Are you ready to watch this video? Let us know where and when you are watching it. Comment below. The morning light bathed the steps of the Brookdale Federal Courthouse in a golden hue, casting long shadows from the tall oak trees lining the path. The city was just waking, the streets still hushed, as if the day itself hesitated to begin. Elysia Grant stepped out of her black Lincoln sedan with a practiced grace, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. She adjusted the collar of her tailored navy blazer, the crisp fabric complementing her composed demeanor. In one hand, she held a slim leather case worn at the edges, but meticulously cared for. Her silver-gray hair, coiled tightly against her scalp, shimmered slightly in the early light. To anyone watching, she was simply another professional woman on her way to work, calm, self-assured, and unassuming. But beneath that calm exterior was a mind sharp as glass, honed by years of studying ruling and navigating a system that didn't always welcome her presence. She preferred it this way. No escort, no robe, no announcement. She believed in walking into buildings like this one, quietly like any other citizen, to remind herself where she came from and to see clearly how others were treated in spaces of power. As she ascended the courthouse steps, she breathed in the cool morning air, steadying herself for another day of hearings. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual, and yet in the back of her mind, a flicker of unease stirred. She pushed it aside. Inside, the security checkpoint buzzed with low conversation and the rhythmic beeping of metal detectors. Elysia stepped into line, waiting patiently behind a few others' eyes scanning the familiar faces of clerks and visitors. But then as she approached the front of the line, the atmosphere shifted. "Ma'am, step aside." A voice cut through the quiet. Elysia turned her head slightly. Standing before her was Deputy Carl Henley, a man built like a wall, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with scrutiny. She had seen him before, always rigid, always precise, a stickler for protocol. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone even. "No ID visible." "You can't enter a federal building like that," Henley replied, ignoring her calm demeanor. Without hesitation, Elysia reached into her blazer and retrieved her federal identification badge, holding it out for him to see. The badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of her authority. Henley glanced at it briefly, then with an unsettling casualness, slipped it into his pocket. "I'd like that returned," Elysia said, her voice steady, but her heartbeat quickening. "You in a rush, sweetheart?" he asked, stepping closer, his words laced with condescension. She didn't flinch. "I need to get to a courtroom." Henley nodded, but not in agreement. "Then you'll follow my procedure. Random checks today. This way." He gripped her upper arm firmly and steered her away from the main corridor, down a side hallway that felt colder with each step. Elysia didn't resist. Not yet. Her mind calculated every move, every word. The hallway ended in a windowless room, sterile, silent, ominous. There waiting was a steel chair, a small cart of scanning equipment, and something that made her chest tighten. A pair of electric clippers. Her breath caught. "I don't consent to this," she said clearly. Henley's eyes narrowed. "Sit down." And in that moment, Elysia knew. This wasn't just about protocol. This was about power. The room felt colder than it should have. The hum of the air conditioning buzzed faintly, but it wasn't the temperature that sent a chill through Alicia's spine. It was the stillness, the sterility, the suffocating weight of what was about to happen. Deputy Carl Henley stood over her, looming eyes hard with something unspoken. There was no reason for this, no justification, but reason had left the room the moment he pocketed her badge. This wasn't about security anymore. This was personal. "I don't consent to this." Elysia repeated, her voice unwavering, even as her heart pounded like a drum inside her chest. She stayed seated, her back straight, hands clasped tightly on her lap. Henley didn't respond. Instead, he motioned to two other officers who had entered the room silently. One was younger, nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot, his shaved head glistening under the harsh lights. The other, a woman in her early 30s, avoided Alicia's eyes entirely, her face stiff, unreadable. "This is unnecessary," Elysia said again, her tone cutting through the silence like a blade. "You have no legal right to detain me." Henley smirked, reaching for the clippers on the table. "You're acting suspicious," he said flatly, flicking the switch. The buzz filled the room instantly, loud, mechanical, cruel. Alicia's breath caught. "You're violating federal law." Henley leaned in, his voice a low growl. "You think that badge you showed me means something in here? You don't walk in here like you own the place and expect special treatment. Now sit still." Before she could react, the younger officer gripped her wrist tightly. The female officer placed a hand on her shoulder, pushing her gently but firmly against the cold metal of the chair's backrest. Elysia didn't struggle. She didn't scream. Her body remained still, but inside a fire ignited a slow burning fury, deeper than humiliation, sharper than fear. Her eyes stayed fixed on the blank wall ahead as Henley stepped behind her, one hand gripping the back of her head. The first touch of the clippers was like a shock wave. The cold metal kissed her scalp, and with a harsh whir, the first coil of silver hair fell to the floor. She closed her eyes, not in defeat, in resolve. Another lock fell, and another. Each strand that tumbled to the ground was more than hair. It was her history, her identity, years of dignity twisted into those silver coils, now being severed by hands that didn't care, that didn't even bother to ask who she was. "You look better already," the young officer muttered, his voice thin, almost apologetic, but not enough to matter. Henley chuckled. "Should have come in here with some respect." Alicia's fists clenched tighter in her lap, the skin over her knuckles paling, but her face remained still, almost serene. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. Henley laughed, wiping stray hairs from his sleeve. "People like you always say that." When it was done, he turned off the clippers, the silence that followed as loud as the buzzing had been. "You're free to go," he said, stepping back. "Courtroom's that way." Elysia stood slowly, her legs steady, though the air felt thick around her. Her scalp tingled raw, exposed, but she held her head high. She walked to Henley's desk, took her badge from where it lay, and without a word stepped out into the hallway. Every step echoed, every breath felt heavier, but inside her chest something else stirred. Purpose. The hallway outside the screening room was almost empty, save for a few clerks who quickly averted their gaze as she passed. They had seen, maybe not everything, but enough. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Their silence was as loud as any insult. Elysia didn't stop. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Her destination lay ahead, and with each step she shed not just hair, but the weight of expectation, of politeness, of patience, that part of her was gone now, stripped away along with the silver that once crowned her head. At the end of the corridor, the doors to the courtroom loomed tall and imposing. Behind them, a storm waited, a case that had drawn national attention, a trial where power and brutality would stand exposed. Elysia was supposed to enter through the private chambers, her robe waiting inside the rituals of respect preserved. But not today. Today she walked through the main doors, pushing them open. The room fell silent, all eyes turned. Lawyers, reporters, defendants, plaintiffs, all froze. Her shoes clicked against the marble floor. Each step steady, deliberate. She didn't flinch under their stares. She didn't bow her head. At the front of the room, the judge's bench stood empty, waiting. As she approached, recognition rippled through the crowd. The woman they had seen led away humiliated was now standing at the center of it all. She was not a victim. She was the judge. Elysia reached the bench, her hand resting briefly on the robe folded over the chair. She didn't wait for ceremony. She didn't ask for help. She slipped it on herself, the fabric heavy but familiar like armor. She turned to the court clerk. "Is the docket ready?" She asked, her voice clear, unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor." The clerk stammered, eyes wide. Elysia nodded, taking her seat. Her gaze swept the room, but she didn't look at Henley. "Not yet. We will begin with preliminary testimony in the case of the People versus Brookdale Police Department, charges of abuse of power, excessive force, and civil rights violations." The courtroom shifted uneasily. She continued, her voice firm. "All parties present." A murmur of confirmation echoed. "Good, let's proceed." The storm had arrived, and Elysia was ready. The courtroom was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforted. It was heavy, expectant, like the breath before a storm breaks. Every pair of eyes followed Elysia Grant, the woman they had seen moments ago, stripped of dignity, now seated high upon the bench, her robe draped over her like a mantle of iron. She sat with perfect composure, her face calm, but not cold-measured. The kind of calm born not from peace but from control. Her eyes swept the room, not missing a single detail. The tight lips of the defense attorneys, the restless fidgeting of the officers seated at the defense table and in the back near the exit. The rigid, statue-like figure of Deputy Carl Henley. Henley didn't move. His face was pale, his hands twitching slightly at his belt. And in that moment, Elysia saw something that pleased her. Not fear exactly, but the realization of consequence. The first witness spoke, his voice echoing through the chamber. A man in his 60s there to recount how his son had been brutalized during a peaceful protest, left with injuries that would never fully heal. Elysia listened, taking notes, her face unreadable. The man's words hung in the air, filled with grief, anger, and an aching hope that someone would finally listen. When he was done, Elysia nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. Your courage is noted." The man stepped down, glancing back at her eyes shining with something like gratitude. Elysia turned to the room. "We will recess for 15 minutes. The courtroom stirred, whispers rising like smoke as people filed out. But Elysia didn't move. She remained seated, watching, waiting. Henley lingered near the door, unsure whether to leave or stay. "Deputy Henley." Elysia called, her voice slicing through the murmur like a blade. He froze. "Step forward." He hesitated, then slowly obeyed his footsteps, uneven, as he made his way to the center of the room. The few who remained clerks, a couple of junior officers, stood still, eyes wide. Henley stood in the open space beneath her gaze, a man stripped of his swagger. "State your full name for the record." His throat bobbed. Carl Henley." "How long have you served as a court officer in this building?" 13 years. Elysia tapped a pen against her notepad once, twice. In those 13 years, how many individuals have you subjected to unlawful searches? I don't know what you mean. Her eyes narrowed. Let me be clear. How many times have you used your position to intimidate, humiliate, or assault civilians? Silence. I don't recall. Henley muttered, convenient. Elysia said, her tone still level. Are you aware that there have been 9 formal complaints filed against you in the last 5 years alone? His face reddened. Those were dismissed. Yes, they were, she replied, buried, ignored like so many others. She leaned forward slightly. And this morning you added one more to that list. Henley opened his mouth, but she raised her hand. No, not today. Today you will not speak lies in this room. Her gaze was unrelenting, steady as a stone. You assaulted a federal judge in her own courthouse. You detained me without cause, violated my rights, and tried to strip me of more than just my hair. You tried to strip me of my humanity. Henley looked around as if someone might step in, might save him. But the room was silent, empty of allies. Elysia stood slowly, her robe falling heavily around her. Because of you, this court is tainted. Because of men like you, trust in this system has eroded. Her voice rose not in volume, but in force. And because of you, there will be change. She motioned to the junior officers near the door. Deputy Henley is to be taken into custody, effective immediately. He is to be held separate from general population. Charges are forthcoming. Henley stepped back. You can't do this. I just did, she said, and turned away. As the officers moved in, cuffing him, the weight of the moment sank in. He was no longer the predator, but the prey. No longer the wielder of power, but subject to it. When the door closed behind him, Elysia exhaled slowly. It wasn't relief, it was resolve. Minutes later, the courtroom filled again, word having spread like wildfire. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Cameras from outside caught the tension through narrow windows, and the air buzzed with something new, a mix of fear, curiosity, and hope. Elysia took her seat once more. She didn't need to reassert control. It was hers now, not because of her title, but because of what she had done. The prosecution rose. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we would like to submit into evidence documentation of suppressed complaints related to Deputy Henley and others within the Brookdale Courthouse. Elysia nodded. Submit them. Let the truth be recorded. A heavy file was passed to the clerk, then handed to her. She flipped it open, scanning signatures, statements, and internal memos. And there it was, the name she had feared yet expected. Judge Marcus Hale, her mentor, her sponsor. His signature appeared over and over, authorizing the dismissal of complaints, justifying Henley's behavior in the name of order. Her stomach tightened. She closed the file. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning. She said, we are not done. As the room emptied, one of her clerks approached, voice low. Judge Grant, there's more. Other victims, people outside waiting. They want to speak. Elysia stood, the file still in her hand. Let them. She turned back to the bench, eyes fixed on the room that had witnessed both her humiliation and her triumph. This wasn't over, not yet. And when it was, the walls of this courthouse would never stand the same again. The next morning, the sky above Brookdale was a dull gray, heavy with the threat of rain. Inside the courthouse, the mood was just as thick. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a trial. This was a reckoning. Elysia Grant stood at her office window looking down at the growing crowd outside, protesters, reporters. Former victims' faces, both familiar and new signs, waved in the breeze. Justice for all and the silence. Dignity can't be denied. Each word felt like fuel to the fire burning inside her. On her desk lay the file she had received the night before, a collection of suppressed complaints, buried grievances, and most damning of all, the signature of Judge Marcus Hale, the man who once told her she was the future of the bench. Her hand hovered over the pages. She had once admired him, trusted him. He had been her guide, her shield, her voice in rooms she wasn't supposed to enter. And now he was the architect of her violation. There was a knock. Her clerk, Mara Jensen, entered, eyes wide with urgency. "Your Honor, Judge Hale is here. He's asking to speak with you privately." Elysia turned slowly, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. "Send him in." Mara hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yes." The door closed behind Mara, and seconds later it opened again. Marcus Hale stepped inside his once proud frame. Somehow smaller shoulders slouched, face drawn. His eyes scanned the room, avoiding hers at first, but then settling on her with a familiar mix of authority and regret. "Elysia," he began, voice low, "I came to explain." She remained standing, arms crossed, her robe draped over the chair behind her like a shadow. "Explain," she echoed, "or justify?" He took a cautious step forward. "I didn't know what happened to you yesterday until after I was horrified." "Were you?" Her voice didn't rise, but it was sharp enough to cut. "Because your signature is on every document that kept men like Henley in power, you protected him." "I did what I thought was best for the court," he said quickly. "For stability, you have to understand." "No," she shook her head. "I don't have to understand why you chose silence over justice, why you let people suffer to preserve your image of control." His mouth tightened. "There's more at stake here than you realize. If you bring this all to light, you'll tear down the very institution you're trying to protect." She took a step closer, eyes blazing. "No, Marcus, I'm not tearing it down. I'm exposing it. There's a difference." For a moment he said nothing, only stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You've changed," he murmured. "No," she replied. "I've just stopped pretending." He exhaled, defeated. "What are you going to do?" Elysia didn't answer right away. She turned back to the window, watching as the rain began to fall, streaking the glass with thin lines. What should have been done years ago? Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The gallery was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, some with notebooks, others with cameras, all waiting. The buzz of whispers died the moment Elysia entered. She took her seat slowly, deliberately, letting the silence settle. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice steady. Before the prosecution could rise, she spoke again. "Before we proceed, I have a motion to introduce." She nodded to Mara, who stepped forward and handed 2 thick folders to the defense and prosecution. "These documents contain all prior complaints filed against Deputy Carl Henley, along with evidence of their suppression. It also includes the names of officials who authorized their dismissal." A murmur rose, quickly silenced by the sharp tap of her gavel. "Let the record show," Elysia continued, "that this court will no longer serve as a sanctuary for misconduct. Silence will not be our shield, truth will." The defense attorney, Robert Clive, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, we object. This is an attempt to shift focus. You are compromising the impartiality of this court." Elysia turned to him, her expression unwavering. "The only thing compromised here, counselor, is the integrity of this courthouse long before I sat on this bench." Clive pressed on. "Then we request your recusal on grounds of personal involvement." The room gasped. Even some in the gallery shook their heads. Elysia stood the robe, seeming to ripple with her movement. You think because I was attacked that I can't serve justice? She asked. Let me be clear. I am not seeking vengeance. I am seeking accountability for Henley, for those who protected him, for every person this system failed. She let her gaze sweep the room. I will not step down, and if you believe you have grounds to challenge, that you are free to appeal. She sat the authority in her presence undeniable. Proceed with the next witness. As the day wore on, testimony after testimony piled on the weight of truth. Former employees spoke of fear of threats of being silenced. Victims recounted humiliation, violence, despair. Each word cracked the foundation of the old order. Then came the final blow. A former clerk, Denise Rowland, took the stand. A quiet woman, unassuming, but her voice carried weight. I was instructed to discard complaints, she said, to mark them as resolved even when they weren't. By whom? The prosecutor asked. Denise hesitated, then spoke. Judge Marcus Hale. The courtroom froze. Elysia closed her eyes for a brief second, not in shock but in acceptance. The truth was no longer a weight she bore alone. By day's end, the rain had stopped, but the storm inside had only begun. Elysia remained at her bench, the room nearly empty now. She looked out, not at the faces, but beyond them, to a future that was no longer built on fear, but on truth. Tomorrow she knew the world would see Brookdale differently, but tonight the cracks had become chasms, and there was no going back. The following morning, Brookdale was no longer just a city, it had become a headline. The courthouse, once an institution cloaked in tradition and quiet authority, now stood at the center of a storm. It could no longer contain Elysia. Grant arrived early, her car pulling into the underground parking, while above her a sea of voices gathered. Protesters lined the courthouse steps, their signs bold, their chants rhythmic. Reporters stood on makeshift platforms, cameras rolling live feeds, broadcasting every second the world was watching now. Inside the courthouse buzzed with a different energy, tense, urgent, alive. In her chambers, Elysia stood before the mirror. The silver stubble on her scalp was beginning to grow soft, but defiant. She ran her fingers over it, briefly grounding herself before reaching for her robe. Today the robe felt different, not a burden, but a banner. There was a knock. Mara Jensen stepped in, holding a slip of paper. Your Honor, we've just received another list. More people. More stories. Elysia took the paper, her eyes scanning the names. Each one a silence now breaking. Each one a voice refusing to be lost. Are they ready to speak? She asked. Mara nodded. They are. Elysia folded the paper and placed it in her pocket. Then let's begin. The courtroom was standing room only. Spectators filled every bench, reporters packed along the back, and others stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the woman at the bench. The judge, who had once been humiliated, now commanding the room with unwavering presence. Elysia tapped the gavel. This court is in session. Before the prosecution could proceed, a man in his 60s stood hesitantly near the doorway. His voice trembled as he spoke. Your Honor, may I speak? Elysia recognized him, not from a file but from the crowd outside. She nodded. Step forward. He walked slowly, his shoulders hunched from years of hard labor, his eyes heavy with memories long buried. My name is Louis Franklin. He said, in 2012, I came here to this courthouse. My daughter's case was dismissed. I raised my voice. Deputy Henley slammed me against a wall, broke 2 ribs. The room was silent. I filed a complaint. They told me I fell, that I was clumsy. I never came back. Elysia's voice was soft but firm. You are heard, Mr. Franklin. He nodded, stepping back. But then something shifted. Another hand rose, and another. 5, 10, 15, one by one. People began to stand, each with a story, each with a name. Elysia stood too. "This court will hear you," she said, "all of you." For the next hour, the courtroom became a confessional, stories of abuse, of intimidation, of fear. Each voice added weight, but also light, a truth long hidden, now blazing into the open. When the last person sat, Elysia returned to her bench. "This," she said, "is no longer just about one man. It is about a system that allowed him to thrive, that chose silence over justice." She turned to the prosecution. "Proceed." The next witness was unexpected, a representative from the Department of Justice. Samuel Ortiz took the stand. He had been sent to oversee federal investigations, but what he shared was more than bureaucratic. "We have opened an official inquiry into the Brookdale District Court." He stated preliminary findings show a pattern of misconduct, suppression of complaints, and deliberate obstruction of justice. He handed over a sealed document. "This includes a recommendation for criminal charges against multiple officials, including Judge Marcus Hale." The courtroom buzzed. Cameras clicked. Pens flew across notepads. Alicia's gaze didn't waver. "Let the record show," she said, "that no one is above accountability." By midday, the courthouse steps were filled beyond capacity. What started as a trial was now a movement. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens stood side by side, unified by a single truth. The system was broken, and it was time to fix it. Inside, Elysia called for a brief recess. In her chambers, she sat quietly, her hands folded, her thoughts racing. There was another knock. This time it was someone unexpected. Reverend Thomas Bell, a longtime advocate in Brookdale, stepped inside. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "For what?" "For showing us it's possible that the law doesn't have to be a weapon, it can be a shield." Elysia nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. "There's still more to do," she replied. "I know, and we're ready." Back in the courtroom, Elysia took her seat once more. "This court finds Deputy Carl Henley guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and official misconduct." The room held its breath. "But it doesn't stop here." She stood, robe flowing like a banner behind her. "I am instituting the Grant Mandate, a reform that will hold every officer, every official, every judge accountable. It includes mandatory anti-bias training, psychological evaluations, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination." She held up the document. "This will not be a promise, it will be a policy, and I will carry it to every courtroom, every council, every chamber that will listen." She turned to the gallery. "You were silenced, not anymore." And with that, she tapped the gavel. "Court is adjourned." Outside, the rain had returned, but no one moved. They stood not in protest, but in presence and power. And as Elysia stepped onto the courthouse steps, bareheaded eyes lifted the crowd, parted not in fear, but in respect. The system had been exposed, and now finally it would change. By the time the final day of the hearing arrived, the air in Brookdale was electric. The courthouse, once a place of routine and quiet oppression, now pulsed with energy, a mixture of defiance, fear, and hope. The rain had returned, falling in heavy sheets, washing over the steps, where crowds still gathered undeterred by the storm. Inside, the walls themselves seemed to hum, as if aware that what was about to unfold would change them forever. Elysia Grant stood alone in her chambers, a heavy file in front of her, marked confidential. She had barely slept, the weight of what she now knew pressing into her chest like stone. Inside the file were the final pieces of a puzzle she wished had never existed. Judge Marcus Hale, the man who had once mentored her, had not just looked the other way. He had orchestrated silence, emails, memos, direct orders to dismiss complaints, to protect men like Henley, not because he believed in them, but because he believed in the illusion of order, even if built on fear. She ran her hand over the papers, her fingers trembling, not with weakness, but with fury. There was a knock. Mara entered soaked from her dash across the courtyard, her hair sticking to her face. "Your Honor," she said breathlessly, "the Senate Judiciary Committee is requesting your formal statement." Elysia nodded. "Tell them I'll send it." "There's more," Mara added, hesitating. "Two judges and a former district attorney resigned this morning. They've cited health reasons, but they know." Elysia finished, her voice quiet. "They know what's coming." Mara stepped back, unsure of what else to say, but Elysia already knew. She stood gathering the file and headed for the courtroom. This day would not end like the others. Today she wasn't just a judge. Today she was the line between what had been and what would never be again. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity. National news outlets had arrived. Rows of legal scholars, law students, activists, and ordinary citizens sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the bench. Elysia entered without announcement. She didn't need one. The room stood. She took her seat. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice resonating through the space. Before the prosecution could proceed, she raised her hand. "Before we hear closing arguments, I have new evidence to submit into the record." Mara stepped forward, handing the file to the clerk, who distributed copies to the defense and prosecution. These documents contain detailed accounts of systemic misconduct, including evidence that multiple officials, including Judge Marcus Hale, actively suppressed complaints and allowed a culture of abuse to thrive within this courthouse. A murmur rippled through the room. Elysia continued, her gaze steady. "Let the record show that justice delayed is justice denied, and no title, no position, no tenure will shield anyone from accountability." The defense attorney, Robert Clive, rose again, his voice strained. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this has gone beyond the scope of the original trial. You are setting a dangerous precedent." Elysia leaned forward, eyes sharp. "No, counselor, I'm ending one." For the next several hours, testimony unfolded like a dam breaking. Witnesses who had waited years to be heard stood tall. Clerks who had been complicit by fear or coercion admitted their roles, and former officials now stripped of power were named. Then came the final witness. A young woman barely in her 20s stepped forward. Nina Alvarez, a former intern. Her hands shook as she took the oath, but her voice when it came was clear. "I worked here last summer," she began. "One day I saw Deputy Henley detain a young man without cause. I tried to report it." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I was told to stay quiet, that it wasn't my place, that I didn't understand how things worked." Elysia watched her, remembering the same words spoken to her long ago. "And I believed them," Nina whispered, "but I don't anymore." Elysia nodded once slowly. "Thank you for your truth." When the testimonies ended, the room was silent. Not from fear, but from weight, the kind that settles when something once hidden has been laid bare. Elysia stood. "This court finds Deputy Carl Henley guilty of all charges. He is sentenced to the maximum penalties allowed by law, 12 years imprisonment." Henley, pale and hollow, stood beside his attorney, unable to speak. But Elysia wasn't finished. "This court also recommends immediate investigation into all officials named in these proceedings, and further recommends federal oversight of the Brookdale District Court for the next 5 years." She held up a final document. "This is the Grant mandate, now formally adopted. It will require anti-bias training, psychological evaluations, and enforce zero tolerance for discrimination and abuse within all courthouse staff." Her eyes swept the room. We cannot change the past, but we will no longer allow it to dictate the future. As the gavel fell for the last time, no one applauded. They stood not for a show of power, but for a moment of truth. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a thin beam of sunlight pierced the clouds. Elysia stepped from the bench, the robe heavy on her shoulders, but her heart lightened. The system had been on trial, and it had been found wanting, but now it could begin again, and so could she. Days had passed since the final gavel strike, but the echoes of what happened in that courtroom still lingered in the city like a fresh wind cutting through old dust. Brookdale, once a place where silence weighed heavier than truth, was now alive with conversation, with reflection, with possibility. The courthouse stood unchanged in form, but transformed in spirit. The halls no longer felt cold, not because they had been physically altered, but because of what they now represented. A place where justice had finally looked itself in the mirror and chosen to act. Elysia Grant sat quietly in her chambers, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Her robe hung on the back of her chair, not cast aside, but resting, a symbol now of something reclaimed, not imposed. On her desk, letters piled up, notes from strangers, from colleagues, from people who had watched, who had listened, who had felt something shift because of her. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to pause. The mirror above her desk reflected a different version of herself. The silver stubble on her head was fuller now, no longer a reminder of pain, but a mark of survival, of choice. She ran a hand over it and smiled, not for others, but for herself. A gentle knock sounded at the door. It was Mara, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Nina Alvarez, the young woman who had testified, whose voice had cracked the silence. Elysia stood crossing the room. "Nina," she said warmly, "please come in." Nina entered, holding a small envelope, her eyes still wide but steadier than before. "I wanted to thank you," Nina said softly, "for letting me speak, for believing me." Elysia shook her head. "You found your voice. That was all you." Nina hesitated, then handed her the envelope. "I got into law school. I wasn't sure before, but now I know this is what I'm meant to do." Elysia took the envelope, her fingers brushing the edge thoughtfully. "You'll be a force," she said, "and you'll remember what it means to listen. That's where real power begins." Nina smiled, a quiet strength in her eyes. "I'll make sure of it." That evening, Elysia walked home for the first time in months. No car, no security, just her, the cool air, and the gentle hum of a city finding its voice. The streets were calm, but the energy had changed. People nodded as she passed, not in awe, but in solidarity. She reached her doorstep, pausing to look at the sky. The storm clouds that had dominated the past days were gone, replaced by a deep, endless blue. A single star blinked in the twilight. Inside, her sister Naomi waited, a familiar smile tugging at her lips. "You're late," Naomi teased Elysia, chuckled the soundlight, almost unfamiliar. "I took the long way." They sat together in silence. No need for words, just the comfort of knowing that the worst had passed and that something new had begun. Later that night, as Elysia stood on her porch, a text buzzed on her phone. "They passed it. The Grant mandate is now law." Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the quiet, overwhelming truth that change, real change, was possible. She looked out at the quiet street, her hand resting over her heart. Justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a promise, and she had kept it. In today's world, justice is more than laws written in books or verdicts delivered in courtrooms. It's about the courage to confront systems that silence the vulnerable and protect the powerful. The story of Elysia Grant reminds us that real change begins not when we accept the way things are, but when we dare to ask why they are that way and demand better. Every day, people face discrimination, bias, and abuse hidden behind uniforms, titles, or traditions, but silence is no longer an option. Whether in our workplaces, communities, or even within ourselves, we must recognize that standing up for what's right often means standing alone. At least at first, Elysia's journey teaches us that dignity isn't something anyone can take. It's something we carry even when tested. And while systems may resist, they are not immovable. It only takes one voice speaking truth to inspire others to rise. In our lives, let us be the ones who listen, who speak, who act. Not for applause, but for accountability, because justice doesn't just live in the courtroom. It lives in every choice we make, every time we choose courage over comfort, truth over silence.